The Harvard professor slammed his hand on the desk mid-presentation. This math doesn't belong in space, and neither do you. The packed lecture hall erupted in laughter, while Jamal stood frozen, his deep space model flickering behind him, half erased from the screen. Phones recorded, emails pinged. One message blinked on his laptop: NASA wants to meet alone. But someone else had already seen it first. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late afternoon sun filtered through the arched windows of Sanders Theater, casting golden bars of light over rows of glossy wooden desks. The lecture hall, once used to host Nobel laureates and presidents, now held the attention of nearly 200 restless Harvard students. Every seat was filled. Phones were tucked away, pens idle. It was final presentation day for advanced concepts in astrophysics, and the room buzzed with curiosity and a trace of envy. Not because it was finals week, but because today, Jamal Trenton was up. At just 19, Jamal had already stirred murmurs across campus. His reclusive nature, combined with flawless scores and groundbreaking ideas, made him a mystery. Most students had never heard him speak, but they knew his name, and that was enough. For weeks, whispers spread about a project so ambitious, it sounded like science fiction, an AI-guided deep space propulsion system, a model that, if viable, could rewrite the rules of interstellar travel. Some dismissed it as freshman fantasy, others hoped it was real, but all were waiting to see if the rumors were true. Jamal stood near the front, black curls tucked under a gray beanie, hoodie sleeves pushed up to his elbows. His hands trembled slightly as he connected his laptop to the projector. His presentation board, minimalist and sharp, leaned against the podium. He cleared his throat once, the only sound he made before the first slide lit the screen. Quantum responsive AI propulsion, a new frontier in deep space travel. Professor Gregory Laskin sat off to the side, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Known for his biting critiques and dry sarcasm, Laskin wore the expression of a man already unimpressed. His lectures were infamous. If he called your project interesting, it meant you'd done something extraordinary. But if he laughed, well, you'd better not come back. Jamal's voice was calm but deliberate. As he began, this model uses a neural network trained on quantum fluctuations to predict and adapt propulsion outputs in real time. It doesn't just respond to course corrections. It anticipates them. A ripple moved through the room. Jamal's slides illustrated the mechanism with layered precision fluid graphics, datasets, comparative metrics. There was math, so much math, but his delivery made it feel accessible, even thrilling. Students leaned forward. Several took notes. Then came the moment Jamal knew would divide the room. He clicked to a slide showing simulated projections. A spacecraft reaching Neptune in under 3 years, Mars in under 4 months, all with 92% energy efficiency. And that was when it happened. A dry, unmistakable chuckle. Laskin. Neptune in 3 years, the professor said, his voice louder than necessary. Are we skipping the part where we validate physics now? The room stiffened. A few students glanced at each other, uncertain whether to laugh or wait. Jamal froze, his hand hovering over the next slide. I mean, Laskin continued, leaning forward now, AI that's trained on quantum fluctuations, adapting faster than speed of light delays. That's not propulsion, Mr. Trenton. That's fantasy. You're describing Star Trek with a Python script. And then the laughter came. Sharp, nervous, and too loud. A cruel chorus that echoed off the stone walls and bounced back onto Jamal like a slap. Jamal didn't flinch, not outwardly, but something behind his eyes dimmed. His lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but he stopped himself. He looked at Laskin, then back at the projection. Silence crawled into the room. If you're finished mocking, Jamal said quietly, I'd like to show the energy variance analysis. It includes error margins. That sentence should have restored control. But it didn't. Laskin stood. Not a gesture he often made. No, Mr. Trenton, I think we've seen enough. He turned to the class. Let this be a reminder. Science isn't science if you ignore the laws that govern it. Ambition isn't a substitute for reality. Jamal's mouth went dry. His jaw clenched. For a second, he looked like he might walk out. And then a sound. A soft ding. His laptop. Jamal glanced at the bottom corner of the screen. A new email. From Intern Director. As subject urgent. Confidential opportunity. He stared. The room was still chuckling, As Jamal slowly clicked the notification, no one else noticed. The body of the email appeared. Mr. Trenton, your propulsion paper and simulation models were forwarded to our office. We are impressed. NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab would like to invite you for a private briefing on your research. Please confirm receipt immediately. Jamal's heart pounded. He looked up from the screen. The class was still laughing. Laskin had returned to his chair, smug and dismissive. But Jamal wasn't looking at them anymore, because beneath the NASA signature, in fine print, was a final line. Please do not inform your university until after the debrief. For a second he just blinked, stunned. The humiliation that had stung only moments before began to transform into something else. Something sharp, electric. He wasn't imagining it. They had seen. Someone out there understood what he had built. And then, just as he was processing the magnitude of what he'd read, a second notification slid across the screen, this time from an anonymous address. No subject line, just 4 words in the email body. We saw what happened. Jamal blinked twice, stunned. His humiliation had just turned into a portal, one leading to something far more dangerous than he ever expected. Jamal left Sanders Theater without waiting for dismissal, the echo of laughter clinging to him, as if it had soaked into his clothes. The heavy doors shut behind him, but the sound followed anyway, replaying in his head with cruel precision. Outside, the Cambridge air was sharp and unforgiving, yet it did nothing to clear the tightness in his chest. Students spilled out in groups, their voices animated, dissecting the moment he had just lived through, as if it were a scene from a movie, rather than a public dismantling of a real person. No one stopped him. No one asked if he was okay. Jamal walked faster, head lowered, the NASA email feeling unreal now, almost dangerous, like a fragile secret pressed against a wound that was still bleeding. By the time he reached his dorm room, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating exhaustion. He sat on the edge of his bed, laptop open but untouched, staring past the screen, as Professor Laskin's laugh replayed again and again in his mind. It wasn't just the ridicule that hurt, it was the way the room had turned on him instantly. How authority had transformed mockery into permission. Jamal had expected resistance here, subtle barriers disguised as academic rigor and professionalism. But he hadn't expected it to be so public, so casually cruel. His phone vibrated, then vibrated again, pulling him out of his thought. When he finally looked, he saw it spreading faster than he could process: messages, tags, notifications piling up like evidence he couldn't erase. Someone had recorded the presentation. Not the beginning, not the careful buildup of his ideas, but the exact moment Laskin laughed. The clip was short, sharp, and devastatingly effective. It cut directly to the professor's scoff, the dismissive comment, and the laughter that followed. The caption mocked him openly, framing his ambition as delusion. Jamal watched the video once, then again, feeling something cold settle in his stomach, as he realized how easily the narrative had been shaped without him. Within hours, the clip had left the campus bubble and entered the wider internet, where context meant nothing, and cruelty traveled faster than truth. By midnight, the humiliation had transformed into spectacle. The clip bounced across platforms, accumulating views and commentary from people who had never met him, never heard his full presentation, never cared to understand what he was building. Some comments laughed at him, reducing him to a punchline. Others attacked his intelligence, his voice, his confidence, twisting his silence into proof that he didn't belong. And then there were the comments that didn't bother hiding their racism, framing his ambition as arrogance, his presence at Harvard as a mistake that needed correcting. Jamal scrolled despite knowing he shouldn't, each line carving away another layer of composure he had spent years building. What unsettled him most was who joined in. Verified accounts praised Professor Laskin for protecting scientific standards. Alumni framed the moment as a lesson in humility. Media pages reposted the clip with playful captions, treating it like harmless academic drama. No one questioned why a freshman had been publicly ridiculed instead of challenged. No one questioned the power imbalance. The humiliation wasn't accidental anymore. It had been validated, repackaged, and monetized. When Jamal finally closed his laptop, the room felt too quiet, as if the noise had hollowed it out. The next morning brought no relief. Sunlight crept through the window, but his phone lit up immediately, vibrating non-stop. Overnight, the clip had crossed a line from viral to polarizing. His name trended briefly, detached from his identity, and turned into a symbol for arguments he never asked to represent. As he scrolled, His jaw tightened. A science influencer he once admired had posted the clip with a caption questioning whether diversity initiatives were lowering standards in elite STEM spaces. Thousands of people agreed publicly, debating Jamal's worth as if he were a theoretical problem, instead of a 19-year-old student sitting alone in a dorm room. An email from the department arrived mid-morning, its tone polite and sterile. It reminded him about professionalism, about receiving criticism with grace, about respecting academic hierarchy. It never mentioned the professor's behavior. It never acknowledged the viral video. The message made one thing clear without saying it outright. Whatever had happened, the responsibility to absorb it quietly belonged to Jamal. His roommate hovered nearby, awkward and unsure, offering half-hearted sympathy before retreating, leaving Jamal alone again, with the weight of it all. By afternoon, the narrative had hardened. Forums accused him of exaggeration. Blogs questioned his integrity. Threads suggested investigations into his work, implying dishonesty without evidence. The racism became more refined, hidden behind phrases like merit, realism, and standards. Jamal recognized the pattern immediately. It was familiar, just amplified now, broadcast to millions. Then the emails shifted in tone. At first they were smug, patronizing, pretending to offer advice. Then they grew sharper, more direct, less concerned with sounding respectable. Messages told him he didn't belong, that he had overstepped, that people like him needed to remember their place. Late that night, as exhaustion finally pulled him towards sleep, a new email arrived from an anonymous address. The message was short and chilling, warning him to delete his project, suggesting consequences for people like him who refused to stay quiet. His heart raced as he reread it, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he felt within walls that were supposed to represent safety and prestige. More messages followed, each one reinforcing the same idea. His ambition was a threat, and threats needed to be neutralized. The NASA invitation felt distant now, fragile, almost impossible, as if it could vanish the moment someone decided it shouldn't exist. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by vibrations from his phone, and the constant sense of being watched. When morning arrived again, Jamal stared at his screen, numb, until a final message appeared. This one different. No insult, no threat, no mockery, just a single line that made his pulse spike and his stomach tighten all at once. "They're setting you up." Jamal sat frozen, realizing the viral humiliation might not have been the end of the attack, but the beginning of something far more deliberate and dangerous. Jamal tried to convince himself that if he just kept his head down, the storm would pass. He avoided eye contact in the halls, stopped raising his hand in class, and began skipping meals just to avoid the dining commons, where whispers now felt louder than shouts. But the whispers didn't stop. They changed form, turned more sophisticated, crueler. The racism that once laughed openly in a lecture hall had now put on a suit, shaved its edges, and started speaking in soft, polished tones. In his physics lab, Jamal noticed the shift almost immediately. Where once his classmates had at least acknowledged him with nods or shallow pleasantries, now they acted like he didn't exist. During group assignments, no one asked him to join. When he tried to insert himself into groups, he was met with vague explanations. Someone had already claimed that seat. Someone else was already covering that dataset. But when he checked the rosters, he saw names listed twice. He wasn't just being left out, he was being pushed out. And yet it was all done with just enough deniability to make complaints sound paranoid. Professor Laskin, unsurprisingly, offered no support. Jamal stopped attending his lectures altogether. But even in other classrooms, he began to feel the weight of invisible eyes. When he asked a question, the response was colder, flatter. One professor corrected him mid-sentence, not because he was wrong, but to remind him of his place. Another didn't acknowledge his raised hand for the entire semester. Jamal began to shrink. He adjusted his posture, made himself smaller, less noticeable. It was survival now. He tried to find a rhythm again. He focused on rebuilding his project privately, refining the propulsion model, while ignoring the noise outside his door. But every time he made progress, something pulled him back under. It started with a group text message screenshot that circulated within a student forum. His name was there, alongside derogatory comments about his attitude, jokes about being the next affirmative action mistake, and a disturbing suggestion that someone file a complaint to get him removed from the research lab. Jamal never saw who sent it, but he felt the impact immediately. The next day, his lab access was revoked without explanation. He emailed the lab coordinator, only to receive a one-line response: "Your presence has been deemed disruptive to group cohesion." Jamal stared at the screen in disbelief. Disruptive? He had never raised his voice, never missed a deadline, never violated a policy. What he had done, though, was exist, black, brilliant, invisible in a space that only pretended to value inclusion. The message was clear: you're allowed to be here, but not if you make others uncomfortable by succeeding too much. A week later, during a small seminar, Jamal asked a simple question, clarification on a formula. The professor paused, his eyes narrowing. Then he tilted his head and said, "Let's try not to challenge everything, Mr. Trenton. You've already made your reputation clear enough." The room went quiet. Some students smirked. Jamal said nothing, but he felt something inside him calcify. It wasn't just exclusion anymore. It was character assassination, brick by subtle brick. That afternoon, a campus safety officer showed up outside Jamal's dorm room. Not a full uniformed cop, just a man in a blue jacket, with a badge and a clipboard. He knocked once, and when Jamal answered, the man smiled. "Just doing a quick check-in. There's been a report," he said lightly. "A report about what?" Jamal asked, heart beginning to race. The officer didn't answer directly. He asked a few vague questions about Jamal's behavior. If he felt stressed, if he'd had any emotional episodes. It was framed as concern, but Jamal could hear the real question underneath. "Are you going to cause a problem?" After the officer left, Jamal found himself standing still for several minutes, gripping the edge of his desk. He realized it then. This wasn't about one email, one presentation, or even one professor. This was systemic, invisible hands, slowly tightening around his future. Racism here didn't always shout. Sometimes it smiled. Sometimes it checked in. Sometimes it used the language of safety, professionalism, and community to erase you. He began documenting everything. Every email, every exclusion, every thinly veiled accusation. He stopped talking in class entirely. Not out of fear, but because he now understood how every word could be twisted. He spent more time at the library, buried in reference books and simulation data, retraining his neural networks and refining his code. The only thing that made him feel sane anymore was the logic of the math. Numbers didn't lie, people did. One night, after returning from the library, Jamal found a yellow envelope, slipped under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal summons to the dean's office. No reason listed, no context. The last time a student in his dorm got that kind of note, they'd been suspended for plagiarism. Jamal sat down slowly, scanning the paper again. His first thought was panic. He had already been warned by anonymous messages that someone was trying to set him up. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Not with a confrontation, but with quiet administrative sabotage. He arrived at the dean's office the next morning, wearing a collared shirt for the first time in weeks. The secretary gave him a forced smile and told him to wait. The walls were covered in framed photos, smiling students, major donors, politicians shaking hands with university presidents. Jamal stared at one photo too long and felt the eyes in the frame watching him back. Finally, the dean emerged. A tall, silver-haired man with an affable expression. He gestured Jamal inside, offered him water, and sat behind a desk, polished to a mirror sheen. The first few minutes were small talk, grades, classes, campus adjustment. It felt rehearsed, like a speech the dean had given dozens of times before. Then the dean leaned forward. "I want to talk to you about a very unique opportunity," he said. Jamal blinked. "I thought this was about—" The dean smiled, cutting him off. No disciplinary issue. In fact, quite the opposite. Someone's taken a special interest in you." Jamal frowned. "Who?" The dean hesitated, then slid a folder across the desk. "There's a private donor. He funds innovation grants for underrepresented students in STEM. He saw your presentation, and while, let's say, the delivery had its complications, he was intrigued by your ideas." Jamal opened the folder. Inside was a short proposal template and a contact card. No company name, just a man's name, an email address, and a Harvard crest stamped in the corner. The offer was generous: stipend, private lab access, and off-campus mentorship. But something felt off. "This isn't through NASA," Jamal said slowly. The dean smiled again. "No, but it's connected to certain industries. You'd be surprised who watches these lectures." Jamal closed the folder, fingers tightening around the edges. As he left the office, folder under his arm, his phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. "Don't trust the dean. That grant ends careers." The email arrived at 6:12 a.m. Quiet and clinical, the kind that pretended to be routine, while carrying the weight of a verdict. Jamal saw the sender before he opened it, Office of Undergraduate Academic Review, and felt a slow, creeping cold settle in his chest. He had slept poorly, the anonymous warnings still echoing in his head, but nothing prepared him for the precision of the language that followed. The letter congratulated him on maintaining a perfect GPA, then pivoted without apology. It cited ongoing concerns regarding his academic conduct, his difficulty collaborating within assessed research environments, and most devastatingly, a preliminary review into academic integrity. The words were polished, bloodless, and final. Effective immediately, Jamal was being placed on academic probation. He read it twice, then a third time, looking for a mistake that never appeared. Academic integrity. The phrase sat there like an accusation that didn't need proof to do damage. Probation meant restricted access to labs, mandatory oversight, and a permanent mark that would follow him through recommendation letters and internship applications. It meant NASA, already fragile, already secret, was gone, not delayed, gone. Jamal leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, his mind racing through every assignment he had submitted, every collaboration he had attempted, every moment he had been isolated by design, and then blamed for the isolation itself. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't cut corners. He had worked harder than anyone he knew. And still, the letter read as if the university had been waiting for an excuse. He forwarded the email to the academic advisor assigned to his program, attaching a brief response that asked for clarification in a meeting. The reply came back within minutes, startlingly fast. The advisor expressed concern, sympathy, and regret, then suggested Jamal reflect on the feedback and comply with the probationary terms to demonstrate growth. There would be a review at the end of the semester, the advisor wrote, assuming no further incidents occurred. Jamal read between the lines easily now. There would always be another incident. Growth was a moving target. Compliance was the goal. The campus felt different after that. Not louder, not quieter, just colder. Doors that had once been neutral now felt closed. In class, Jamal noticed the way professors avoided meeting his eyes, how discussions moved around him like he was a hazard rather than a contributor. In the library, a security guard lingered near his table longer than necessary, pretending to straighten books while watching his screen. The message was subtle but unmistakable. You are being observed. Any misstep will be documented. Any excellence will be questioned. By midweek, the probation had already done its work. His lab access card failed at the scanner, flashing red with a polite denial. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door as students passed behind him, some glancing over with curiosity, others with relief that the attention wasn't on them. He emailed the lab coordinator again, attaching the letter and asking for temporary access to retrieve personal equipment. The reply arrived an hour later, brief and apologetic, informing him that protocol didn't allow exceptions during an integrity review. Jamal shut his laptop slowly, aware that the project he had been refining, the one NASA had seen, the one that had made him a target, was now locked away behind policies written to look neutral while doing very specific harm. That evening his phone buzzed with another message from the anonymous thread that had haunted him since the presentation. This one was longer, careful in its wording. It told him probation was the lever they always pulled first. It told him to watch who benefited from his isolation. It told him not to appeal alone. Jamal typed a response for the first time asking who was behind the messages, how they knew what was happening. The reply came seconds later, unsettling in its certainty. They wrote that they had watched this pattern unfold before, that the language was always the same, that the outcomes varied only by how early someone intervened. Jamal set the phone down, his pulse quickening. If this was a script, then he had reached the part where options narrowed. He requested a formal meeting with the review committee, attaching documentation, timestamps of submissions, version histories of code, peer evaluations that contradicted the claim of non-collaboration. The committee acknowledged receipt and scheduled him for a hearing 2 weeks out. 2 weeks was an eternity in academic time. 2 weeks was long enough for rumors to harden into facts, for opportunities to evaporate quietly. Jamal considered contacting NASA, then remembered the line in the email asking him not to inform his university. He wondered if the probation counted as informing them by default. He wondered who would see the mark first, and how quickly it would be interpreted. In the meantime, the dean's unique opportunity hovered like a mirage. The folder sat untouched on Jamal's desk, the donor's name staring up at him, every night. The offer promised private resources and mentorship, a way around the barriers that had suddenly closed. But the warning echoed louder now. Grants that end careers, industry connections without transparency, help that came with strings you couldn't see until they tightened. Jamal imagined accepting the offer, imagined the narrative it would produce, that the university had supported him all along, that the probation was a misunderstanding resolved by generosity. He imagined being owned quietly, his work redirected, his silence purchased. The thought made his stomach turn. On Friday, a professor he respected pulled him aside after class. The man spoke softly, choosing his words with care, saying he couldn't comment officially but advising Jamal to be strategic. He suggested compliance over confrontation, patience over principle. He said institutions moved slowly, that fighting them head-on often made things worse. Jamal listened, nodding, feeling the familiar pressure to be grateful for advice that asked him to accept injustice as wisdom. When the professor finished, Jamal thanked him and left, carrying the weight of being told again that survival required submission. The following Monday, Jamal returned to the building where his lab was housed, hoping against reason that something might change. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant, the floors gleaming in the early morning light. He stood near the locked door longer than he intended, lost in the memory of nights spent there, chasing solutions with a focus that made time irrelevant. He turned to leave and nearly collided with a woman pushing a cleaning cart, her expression calm, observant. She steadied the cart and apologized quietly. Jamal stepped aside, murmuring the same. As he walked away, he felt a light tap at his elbow. He turned back, surprised. The woman glanced down the hallway, then reached into the pocket of her uniform and slipped a small folded note into his hand, with practiced ease. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke. "Don't open it here," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Read it later." Then she returned to her cart and continued down the hall as if nothing had happened. Jamal waited until he was outside, the wind biting through his jacket, before unfolding the paper. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably urgent. 4 words were written in blue ink, pressed hard enough to leave an imprint on the page. They did this before. He stood there, the campus moving around him, students laughing, bikes rattling past, the world indifferent to the shift that had just occurred inside his chest. If they had done this before, then there were records, patterns, survivors. The probation wasn't an end, it was a method. And somewhere beneath the ivy and the smiles, there was a history the university hoped would stay buried. Jamal folded the note and looked back at the building, realizing the next step wasn't proving his innocence. It was uncovering who had been erased before him. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Jamal held it in his palm like it might burn through his skin. They did this before. 4 words, and yet they shattered the illusion that his case was isolated. The cleaning lady had spoken with a calm that hinted at something deeper, something she'd seen too many times to react to anymore. Jamal's mind raced, not just with anger, but with a sudden electrified clarity. If this had happened before, then somewhere evidence existed. Not rumors, not anonymous messages, evidence. And Harvard, for all its sophistication, still ran on paper trails. He didn't go back to class that day. Instead, he walked into the administrative wing of the engineering department, under the guise of submitting a forgotten form. The receptionist barely glanced up as she directed him to the filing office, a gray room nestled behind the labs, where physical records still lived in aging cabinets. Jamal hadn't been there before, but he had seen the door, unremarkable, with a plaque that read "Archives and Maintenance, Authorized Use Only." Today he didn't need authorization. He needed the truth. The air inside was cooler than expected, and dry, like old paper and climate-controlled dust. A long corridor branched off into 3 rooms stacked floor to ceiling with manila folders, document boxes, and metal drawers labeled in faded ink. There were records from decades past, project submissions, student evaluations, administrative notes. It was overwhelming at first, but Jamal wasn't looking for everything. He was looking for patterns. He started with the STEM department logs, pulling records from previous academic probation reviews. The files were arranged by year, each one packed with faculty notes and anonymous student comments. He skimmed through dozens of names, most of them unfamiliar, but every so often, a trend began to form. A black student cited for lack of collaboration, another marked for academic isolation, a third female, honors level labeled as disruptive to lab dynamics. It was eerie how closely the language mirrored his own letter, like a script copied and reused with only the names swapped out. Jamal's hands moved faster, scanning entries from the last 20 years. The codes varied, but the content remained consistent. In nearly every case, the accused students were either Black or Latino, often top performers, and almost always enrolled in research-heavy STEM majors. The notes were coded with professionalism, but the bias bled through in implication. One student had been flagged for excessive initiative, another for overconfidence in technical conclusions. The language punished excellence, especially when it didn't arrive wrapped in whiteness. He found names he recognized, upperclassmen who had vanished from campus mid-semester, others he'd only heard of in whispers. The ones who transferred, who took time off, who decided Harvard wasn't for them. Now he saw what the university had never said. They hadn't left, they'd been pushed. In a far back corner of the room, tucked behind a stack of janitorial reports, Jamal spotted a drawer labeled Faculty Confidential Internal Inquiries. The lock was broken. He slid it open and pulled out a thick folder with the initials CTR, embossed on the tab. The pages inside were old, yellowed at the edges, stapled and signed. One page caught his eye immediately. A faculty review dated 1998, referencing an undergraduate research dispute. The student's name was Malik Freeman. The notes claimed Malik had falsified propulsion data and misrepresented his work to external contacts. But a handwritten annotation scribbled hastily in the margins said something different. Data validated by third-party reviewer. Discrepancy not substantiated. Faculty member Laskin advised to drop matter. Jamal froze. Laskin, his professor. He flipped to the back of the folder, heart pounding. A disciplinary committee report followed, stating that Malik had been denied lab access after continued concerns. 3 weeks later, a note recorded his withdrawal from Harvard. No follow-up, no reinstatement, just silence. Jamal sat on the cold tile floor, surrounded by open files, stunned at the realization that the pattern stretched back not years, but generations. Black students in STEM were being filtered out quietly, strategically, first isolated, then undermined, then erased. And Laskin had been involved longer than Jamal ever imagined. He opened another file, marked A. Hendricks, 2007, and the same story unfolded. Exceptional performance, sudden probation, accusations of data mismanagement, and then disappearance. In the margin, a faint note read, student attempted external contact with NASA, denied access due to departmental concerns. The page included a photocopied letter. Jamal leaned closer. The name signed at the bottom made his blood run cold. Professor Gregory Laskin. It wasn't just history. It was a strategy. A recurring purge disguised as professional scrutiny. And Laskin wasn't just complicit. He was orchestrating it. Jamal's humiliation hadn't been spontaneous. It had been the opening act in a script his professor had performed before, designed to discredit, isolate, and eliminate threats that didn't match the university's image of who a scientist should be. Jamal gathered the most critical pages, folding them into his notebook. He needed to make copies, digital backups, something concrete. As he stood to leave, the door behind him creaked open. He froze, heart leaping into his throat. A figure stepped in, slow, deliberate, silent. It wasn't a faculty member. It was the same cleaning woman who had slipped him the note. She didn't look surprised to see him there. She nodded once and closed the door gently behind her. You found them, she said. Jamal couldn't speak. His throat was dry. She walked over, eyes scanning the open folders. I saw it happen. Not once, not twice. For years. They think no one notices the kids who go missing. Jamal found his voice. Why did you help me? She gave a tired smile. Because the last one tried to expose it. He didn't get far. He felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. You knew Malik Freeman? She nodded. Brilliant kid. Built a propulsion system way ahead of its time. They said he lied. Said he cheated. I saw him break down right here. Same spot you're standing in. Jamal looked around. The cold tiles. The stacks of files. It was more than a record room. It was a graveyard. The woman reached into her coat and handed him a small flash drive. These are copies I made. Just in case. I've been waiting a long time for someone who wouldn't back down. Jamal took it, hands trembling. She gave one last look at the door. Be careful, you're not just dealing with a professor anymore. Jamal opened the flash drive on his laptop back in his dorm. Dozens of files popped up. Names, memos, recordings, internal emails. Some of them had red stamps that read confidential, do not distribute. One folder was labeled Trenton. He clicked it open, pulse racing. Inside were 5 emails exchanged between Professor Laskin and another faculty member, dated before Jamal's presentation. They referenced a risk of external validation, a premature media incident, and the need to preemptively restrict lab access to avoid institutional exposure. One email chilled him more than the rest. If the NASA interest proves real, we'll need to stall. His background's a liability. The email was signed, G. Laskin. Jamal stared at the screen, his breath shallow, as a new thought dawned. NASA hadn't just noticed his project. They might already be under pressure to forget him. The flash drive sat on Jamal's desk like a loaded weapon. He didn't touch it for hours, pacing instead, replaying the emails in his head, the signatures, the casual way Professor Laskin had reduced his future to a liability. Every instinct told him to expose it all, to release the files, tag every reporter who had mocked him, force Harvard to answer for the pattern buried beneath its ivy-covered reputation. He imagined the relief of sunlight, the undeniable clarity of documents speaking where he had been silenced. And yet, the deeper he breathed, the more he felt the counterweight pressing down, the institution's size, its reach, the way it swallowed dissent and spat out cautionary tales. Truth, he realized, did not travel alone. It carried consequence. He drafted an email to a journalist whose article had framed the viral clip as harmless academic banter. He attached nothing, just a line asking if they were interested in seeing internal records. He reread it 5 times, then deleted it. He opened another draft, this time addressed to a civil rights organization, carefully describing the pattern without naming names. He stopped midway, fingers hovering. The anonymous warnings returned to him, layered now with the memory of Malik Freeman's file and the quiet way a brilliant student had vanished without ceremony. Jamal wasn't afraid of backlash. He was afraid of erasure, the administrative kind, that left no bruise but ended everything all the same. His phone rang. Not a text, not an email. A call. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried, unmistakably practiced. The caller didn't introduce themselves. They spoke as if Jamal already understood the rules. They said they were calling out of concern, that Harvard had a duty to protect its students, but also its reputation. They said allegations were serious things, that misunderstandings could spiral quickly. Then the tone shifted, softened further, and the warning arrived wrapped as advice. If Jamal spoke publicly, the review would escalate. His probation could become suspension. Funding would be reevaluated. Immigration status, spoken of delicately, almost apologetically, could be affected by academic standing. Jamal said nothing, listening as the caller outlined futures like doors closing one by one. The voice reminded him that student visas were privileges contingent on compliance, that investigations took time, that patience was often rewarded. When Jamal finally asked who he was speaking to, the caller smiled audibly and said it didn't matter. What mattered was that the university preferred resolution over spectacle. The call ended without a goodbye. Jamal stared at his phone long after the line went dead, the room feeling suddenly smaller, the walls closer than before. He sat down and opened the flash drive again, scrolling through folders with a steadier hand than he expected. Evidence did not guarantee protection. It guaranteed attention, and attention, he now understood, was a currency institutions managed expertly. He thought about his parents, proud and terrified in equal measure when he had been accepted. He thought about the sacrifices that had brought him here, the unspoken promise that excellence would be enough. He thought about NASA, the email, the secrecy, the possibility that even that lifeline could be severed if he miscalculated this moment. For the first time since the presentation, Jamal felt truly trapped between 2 truths. Silence would preserve him temporarily. Exposure might save others later. The days that followed were tense and deliberate. Jamal withdrew from online spaces entirely, letting the noise burn itself out without him. He complied with probation terms, attended mandatory meetings, nodded when expected. He became, outwardly, the model student rediscovering humility. Inside, he cataloged every interaction, every phrasing that hinted at surveillance rather than support. Professors spoke to him with exaggerated gentleness now, as if afraid he might break or accuse. The dean's office sent a follow-up note praising his cooperation. It was all so smooth it felt unreal, like a stage set designed to lull him into believing the danger had passed. Late one evening, Jamal made his decision. He encrypted the files, uploaded copies to a secure cloud account, under a name that wasn't his, and scheduled nothing. No emails, no posts, no leaks. Not yet. He told himself it was strategy, not fear. Timing mattered. Survival mattered. He would wait for a moment, when speaking didn't mean disappearing. He closed his laptop with a resolve that felt heavier than courage, accepting the cost of silence, even as it tasted bitter. The knock came the next afternoon, sharp and unexpected. Jamal wasn't expecting anyone. His schedule was clear by design. He opened the door cautiously. A woman stood in the hallway, mid-30s, confident posture, a visitor badge clipped neatly to her jacket. She smiled, professional and warm, and said his name like it was already familiar. She introduced herself as a recruiter from NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, explaining she was in Cambridge for meetings, and decided to stop by personally. Jamal felt the floor tilt beneath him, the careful equilibrium he'd constructed collapsing in an instant. She glanced down the hall, then back at him, lowering her voice just enough to suggest discretion. She said she'd seen the clip, then the follow-up chatter, and then something else. Internal questions raised by people who shouldn't have been asking them. She said NASA preferred to meet talent directly when institutions complicated things. She asked if they could talk somewhere private. Jamal stepped aside, heart racing, aware that the choice he'd just made to stay silent had been overtaken by events moving faster than Harvard's machinery. As she crossed the threshold, Jamal realized the warning he'd received hadn't anticipated this variable. Silence had bought him time, but time had delivered something unexpected. He closed the door behind them, the files still hidden, the truth still contained, and wondered which would be tested first, Harvard's reach or NASA's interest. As the recruiter set her folder on his desk and asked about the propulsion model by name, Jamal understood that staying silent might no longer be an option, and that someone powerful had decided he was worth the risk. Jamal stood motionless as the NASA recruiter laid a thin folder on his desk, her voice calm, her tone unreadable. The quiet click of the folder hitting the wood seemed louder than it should have, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. She introduced herself more formally now. Ariana Keller, Strategic Talent Liaison, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She didn't mention the university, didn't reference the scandal, didn't even blink at the tension that gripped the room like a wire pulled taut. Instead, she went straight for the core of what she was here for. "We saw what happened," she said without flinching. "And we read what wasn't visible in that 30-second clip." Jamal didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. The weight of what she had just confirmed settled like gravity on his chest. She wasn't here because someone forwarded a resume. She wasn't here for protocol. She was here because NASA, of all institutions, had seen the destruction of a black student on the world's most elite stage, and still saw potential worth salvaging. "We know your propulsion model wasn't just theoretical," she continued, flipping open the folder to reveal diagrams. His diagrams, the same ones Harvard had dismissed as childish, unrealistic, delusional. "And we think you're closer to something disruptive than you probably realize." Jamal stared at the pages, disbelief tightening his throat. He hadn't shared these with anyone outside his advisor and the lab submission system. The realization clicked. Someone had passed them along. Someone inside Harvard had quietly made sure his work didn't vanish with his reputation. "Who sent this?" he asked finally, voice low. She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, but not with warmth, with a professional courtesy laced in boundary. "You've already been entered into our restricted innovation panel for young propulsion researchers. It's not open to the public, by invitation only. Non-disclosed names. Private review." He leaned back slowly, uncertain whether he was hearing a rescue or walking into a trap. "The panel includes engineers from JPL, Langley, and external observers from SpaceX and Blue Origin," she said. "We're not offering you a job, Jamal. We're offering you a space." "And Harvard?" he asked carefully. Her smile faded just enough. "They're not to know. At least, not yet. Participation is off record. Internal. If they interfere, we'll assume your suspicions about sabotage were valid." There it was, the opening wedge between two titans. Jamal felt the shift instantly. Harvard might own his academic fate on paper, but NASA had something else. Leverage, reach, independence. He had always assumed that institutions protected each other in silence. But this was a fracture in the script. A chance. "But if they find out?" he asked. Keller raised an eyebrow. "Then they'd have to explain why they tried to block the kind of innovation they claimed to champion." The proposition was simple. Jamal would fly to the panel location, an undisclosed site in California, present his project to a closed room of scientists, and walk away either anonymous or validated. His name would never touch the public records. Not unless he chose to change that. The risk, however, was monumental. You'd be presenting under your model's name, not your own, Keller added. We're not just protecting you from Harvard. We're protecting the project from premature media framing. Jamal nodded slowly, every nerve in his body tingling with fear and awe. So, I'll be invisible again. No, she said. You'll be seen. Just not recognized. Not yet. He didn't sleep that night. He packed quietly, choosing function over form. No one on campus would notice he was gone. His professors already acted like he wasn't there. The only trace he left was a single sticky note taped under his desk drawer with a password to his cloud archive, and 5 words written in pen. If I disappear, release everything. The next morning, Keller met him outside the back entrance of a quiet lab building, her car already running. No NASA logos, no visible markers, just tinted windows and a silent promise that the rules had changed. They drove in silence until they reached the small private airport outside Boston, where an unmarked government vehicle checked them in. No luggage scans, no security lines, just IDs, printed passes, and a waiting plane. Before boarding, Keller turned to him. Once you land, you're not a student, you're not a victim, you're a scientist. Stay in that mindset. Jamal nodded. As they approached the aircraft, a sleek jet with nothing but a number code on the tail, Keller handed him his boarding pass. His name wasn't on it. Only a designation, observer. The plane's interior was silent and sterile, its walls matte gray, its lighting dimmed. He moved down the aisles slowly, eyes scanning rows of high-backed seats. He found his assigned one near the rear, and stepped forward. Only to stop cold. Someone was already in his seat. A man, white, late 50s, dressed too casually for a government plane, looked up from a tablet and smiled tightly. You're Jamal Trenton, he said, not asking. Jamal's throat tightened. That's my seat. The man didn't move. You've caused quite a stir, kid. You sure you know who you're flying with? Keller appeared behind him a second later, her voice cold, her tone clipped. That seat is reserved. I'll need to see your badge. The man reached into his jacket pocket, slowly and deliberately, and held up a laminated ID. Jamal's eyes locked on the logo. Lockridge Dynamics, a defense contractor notorious for securing government propulsion contracts, especially those connected to space weaponization. Keller's demeanor didn't shift, but her eyes narrowed. She stepped forward, scanned the badge, and held her hand out toward the man. You weren't cleared for this panel. The man's smile faded. He stood slowly, his body language changing from casual to controlled. He handed her the tablet, nodded at Jamal, and walked past them without a word. Jamal watched him go, his pulse hammering. Keller exhaled once, barely audible. He wasn't supposed to know your name, she said. Someone leaked the roster. Jamal sat down slowly, every muscle tight with realization. If defense contractors were watching his movements, this wasn't just about innovation anymore. Someone wanted his silence, or his work. The facility didn't announce itself the way Jamal expected. There were no banners, no sweeping views of rockets poised against the sky. NASA's innovation wing sat low and discreet, a cluster of reinforced buildings wrapped in desert quiet, guarded by protocols rather than spectacle. Jamal followed Ariana Keller through a series of biometric checkpoints, each one confirming his presence while simultaneously reminding him how provisional it was. He had been granted access, not acceptance. Every door that opened did so with a soft mechanical sigh, as if exhaling doubt. They placed him in a temporary workspace adjacent to the demonstration lab. A room with white walls, a glass partition, and a terminal already configured to receive his model. Jamal connected the encrypted drive, watched the familiar interface load, and felt a fragile sense of grounding return. The propulsion simulation bloomed across the screen, elegant, adaptive, alive. This was the work they had tried to bury. This was the thing that had survived laughter, probation, and threats. He exhaled slowly, palms flat on the desk, and let himself believe that for the next few hours, merit might finally outrun sabotage. The panel was scheduled for late afternoon. Engineers filtered in and out of adjacent rooms, their conversations muted, but focused. No one treated Jamal like a novelty here. They treated him like a variable, something to be tested, stress-checked, validated or discarded. It was honest in a way Harvard had never been. Ariana checked in once, asked if he needed anything, then left him alone with the hum of servers and the quiet pressure of expectation. An hour before the demo, Jamal stepped out to grab water. When he returned, the room felt wrong immediately. The terminal screen was dark, not a sleep-off. He frowned and tapped the keyboard. Nothing. He reached for the drive, then froze. The port was empty. The encrypted drive, the only physical copy he'd brought, was gone. For a moment, his mind refused the reality of it. He checked the desk, the floor, his pockets, the adjacent terminal. The room hadn't been breached violently. Nothing else was disturbed. It was surgical, intentional. Jamal felt his pulse spike, a familiar cold threading through his chest, as he realized the pattern had followed him here. This wasn't coincidence. This was pursuit. He called Ariana, immediately. She arrived within minutes, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. As he explained, she didn't question him. She didn't suggest misplacement. She keyed into her tablet and requested security access without hesitation. "Lock the wings," she said calmly. "Pull footage from the last 2 hours. No internal notifications." They moved to the security office, a windowless room where feeds tiled across a wall like a mosaic of controlled order. Jamal watched himself on screen, sitting, working, leaving briefly. He watched the door to his workspace open. While he was gone, a staffer entered, badge visible, posture unremarkable. The man moved with confidence, no rush, no furtive gestures. He unplugged the drive, slipped it into his jacket, and paused, just long enough to look toward the camera. Jamal's breath caught. It wasn't the staffer's face that shattered him. It was the man who stepped into frame seconds later, leaning in to speak quietly, his profile unmistakable even in grainy resolution. Professor Gregory Laskin, older now, hair more silver than Jamal remembered. But the posture was the same. Casual authority, practiced detachment. The two men spoke briefly. Laskin nodded once. The staffer exited. Laskin lingered, eyes scanning the room with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't his first time here. The room went silent, except for the low whir of machines. Jamal felt the heat rise behind his eyes. Not explosive, but dense, controlled. Rage would have been easier. This was something else. Confirmation. The humiliation hadn't been spontaneous. The probation hadn't been procedural. The sabotage wasn't opportunistic. It was coordinated across institutions that pretended to be separate. Ariana didn't swear. She didn't raise her voice. She simply rewound the footage and watched it again, her jaw tightening. "He doesn't have clearance to be here," she said finally. "Not like that." "He's been here before," Jamal replied, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "You saw the files. This is what he does." She nodded once, already moving. "I need to escalate this, but you need to understand something first." She turned to face him fully. "This wasn't just about stopping your demo." Jamal waited. "The drive you brought," she continued, "was mirrored to our internal server when you arrived. Standard redundancy. What they took was the original. What they wanted was to control the narrative. What exists, who owns it, who can claim contamination." Jamal absorbed that slowly. "So they can say it's compromised." "Exactly," Ariana said. "And if it's compromised, it's disqualified. Not because it's wrong, because it's inconvenient." They returned to his workspace, now sealed, the glass reflecting Jamal's face back at him. Older somehow, sharper. Ariana told him the panel would be delayed, officially for technical review, unofficially because someone had crossed a line that NASA couldn't ignore without implicating itself. Jamal felt the familiar tightening of hope and dread, twisting together. Delay could mean protection. It could also mean burial. He didn't wait for permission. "I want to confront him." Ariana hesitated, then nodded. "Not alone." They found Laskin in a conference room near the administrative wing, seated comfortably, hands folded as if he belonged there. He looked up when they entered and smiled faintly, the same expression he'd worn in the lecture hall before dismantling Jamal in public. "Miss Trenton," he said, voice smooth. "I was wondering when you'd connect the dots." Jamal didn't sit. He stood across the table, the space between them charged with everything that had been unsaid for years. "You don't belong here," Jamal said. "You never did." Laskin's smile thinned. "On the contrary, I've belonged here a long time. Longer than you've been alive." He glanced at Ariana. "This young man is brilliant. I'll give him that. But brilliance without guidance becomes liability. Institutions exist to manage that." "You stole his work," Ariana said sharply. "I protected it," Laskin replied without missing a beat. "From premature exposure. From misuse. From narratives that would cheapen it." His eyes returned to Jamal. "You think NASA is different? You think they're immune to pressure?" They answered to the same donors, the same contractors, the same fears. Jamal felt something inside him steady. So you sabotage black students before they can't be controlled. Laskin's expression flickered, not guilt, not denial, but irritation. I shape outcomes. The world isn't fair, Mr. Trenton. I make sure it remains functional. Ariana stood. This conversation is over. Laskin rose as well, unbothered. It's just beginning, he said. You've attracted attention you don't understand. He paused at the door, then added softly, ask yourself why a defense contractor knew your name before your own university did. The words landed harder than any insult. Jamal turned to Ariana as Laskin left, the realization dawning with a chill. He's not acting alone. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. No, and this isn't just about Harvard anymore. She pulled up a secure message on her tablet and turned it toward him. An internal alert, redacted heavily, flagged his project as strategically sensitive. The source wasn't Harvard. It wasn't NASA. It was a joint advisory committee, industry, defense and academic liaisons, designed to manage innovations deemed high risk. Jamal swallowed. So they decide who gets erased. Ariana met his gaze. They decide who gets owned. As Jamal stared at the alert, a new message flashed beneath it. An invitation marked urgent, requesting his presence at a closed-door review he hadn't agreed to, chaired by people who already knew his work better than he did. The notification looked harmless at first, just a standard internal message in NASA's secure intranet system, tagged under background cross-checks. Jamal clicked it out of routine, expecting a confirmation of identity, maybe a standard clearance follow-up. But the moment he saw his name, Jamal Trenton, next to a line that read flagged disciplinary risk, academic integrity, pending, his chest tightened. There it was, in clean font and bureaucratic language, the death sentence of a career barely born. He stared at the entry, fingers trembling slightly, as he clicked through the metadata. The tag wasn't from NASA itself. It had been imported from an external risk-sharing consortium, a digital blacklist maintained privately by an informal coalition of elite university administrators and top-tier tech recruiters. It was supposed to be internal use only, a quiet warning system to filter out candidates with potential reputational complications. Students never saw it. Most didn't even know it existed. But employers trusted it more than transcripts. Jamal's record had been shared without his knowledge. Harvard had uploaded it under the academic probation flag, citing concerns around conduct and collaboration. The same weaponized phrases that had haunted every black student in the basement files he'd found weeks before. Now those words had made the leap from whispers inside campus walls to silent coded rejection across the professional world. He clicked through a list of recipient organizations. It read like a graveyard of ambition. Google, Lockheed Martin, SpaceX, DARPA, every major aerospace and AI lab. All had access to the list. All had already been notified. Every door that should have opened for Jamal was being locked in real time. His propulsion model might be brilliant. His simulations might change deep space travel, but none of it mattered if no one would touch him. Ariana Keller called it what it was: sabotage at scale. They met in the secured comms room, the lights low, the air tense. She didn't sugarcoat it. This is how they bury people without headlines, she said, pulling the list up on her own device. They don't discredit your work, they discredit you. Quietly, efficiently, permanently. Jamal sat across from her, shoulders rigid. Can they even do this legally? They don't have to. These are back-channel evaluations, not hiring decisions, not denials, just red flags that make sure you're never shortlisted. Even if I win the panel? He asked. She paused. It won't matter. That landed like a blade. All of it. His sleepless nights, his sacrifice, the humiliation, the climb had brought him to the door of NASA, only to find the hinges welded shut. He wasn't just fighting to be heard anymore. He was fighting to exist in the eyes of people who had already erased him. They think I'm a threat, Jamal said quietly. Ariana leaned forward. You are, and that's why they're moving fast. She explained how Harvard had sent a confidential advisory to select federal partners, framing Jamal as combative during academic review, and linked to external advocacy groups. It wasn't evidence. It didn't have to be. It was enough to raise doubt, enough to poison the well. She showed him a breakdown of timestamps. The blacklist had been updated, the day after he confronted Laskin. It wasn't just retaliation. It was a response to the fear that he might win. Jamal said nothing for a long time. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, as if willing it to change, to blink, to glitch, to undo itself. But the truth remained steady. His name was no longer just a name. It was a liability. Later that evening, after the lab wing had emptied, Jamal sat alone in the presentation chamber. The demo had been rescheduled for 2 days later, but it already felt like performance without purpose. He rested his hands on the edge of the table, eyes locked on the projection model looping quietly in front of him. He thought of Malik Freeman, of the cleaning woman, of the dozens of files with similar endings. All these stories of brilliance buried beneath false narratives. He wondered how many had reached this exact moment, and decided the cost was too high. Jamal, he turned. A man in an engineer's badge stood in the doorway, mid-40s, wiry, with the kind of face that looked like it had spent too long in labs and too little in boardrooms. His ID read, R. Gossman, Propulsion Dev, Lee. Jamal nodded cautiously. I'm not supposed to be here, Gossman said in a hushed voice. But you need to see something. He gestured for Jamal to follow. They walked down a side corridor, past empty offices and powered-down labs, until they reached a back room marked System Integration Archives. Gossman unlocked it with his ID and slipped inside. The room was cold and filled with data terminals. Gossman pulled up a secure directory, navigated quickly, and opened a folder labeled Deep Space Collaboration, Restricted. Inside was a series of design files, simulations and emails tagged under a defense R&D partnership. Gossman clicked open a propulsion model. Jamal's eyes widened. It was his, or something dangerously close to it. Where did this come from? Jamal asked, voice tight. Gossman looked at him carefully. We received this through a joint proposal from a third-party lab in Boston. They claimed partial development, using open-source inspiration. But the metadata on the model, it traces back to Harvard's internal servers. To your account. Jamal's stomach turned. They stole it, he said. And they sold it. It gets worse, Gossman added. The company that submitted it, Lockridge Dynamics. Jamal's mind reeled. The same contractor who had tried to sit in his seat on the flight. The same company that had been flagged in the files he'd found. This wasn't theoretical anymore. His work was being laundered, rebranded, monetized, and he was being blacklisted to ensure he couldn't claim it. I don't know how deep this goes, Gossman admitted, but I know this someone wanted your name erased, so your work could survive without you. Jamal stared at the screen, breath shallow, watching years of effort, stolen and reassembled under a banner he had never authorized. He wasn't just being excluded from the table. He was being stripped of authorship, while the table was reset for others to feast. What do I do? Jamal asked quietly. Gossman didn't answer. He handed Jamal a small drive. I'm retiring next year, he said. I don't owe them anything, but you still have a shot. You need to decide if you want your name back, or if you want to burn the whole thing down. Jamal looked at the drive in his hand, then at the screen where his stolen future looped without him, and realized the next move might not be about proving himself anymore. It might be about making sure the world knew who stole from him, and who helped them do it. The room felt colder as Gossman scrolled deeper into the archive, the hum of the servers sounding louder now, more insistent, as if the machines themselves were uneasy with what they held. Jamal stood beside him, eyes fixed on the screen, watching the past assemble itself piece by piece. Gossman pulled up a folder nested so deeply it looked intentionally hidden, its label stripped down to an alphanumeric code instead of a name. He hesitated before opening it, then glanced at Jamal with an expression that mixed apology and resolve. He said this wasn't supposed to exist anymore, that someone had tried very hard to make sure it didn't. Then he clicked. The first document was dated 11 years earlier. A formal complaint, meticulously written, addressed to Harvard's Office of Academic Integrity, and co-signed by 3 faculty reviewers. The complainant's name sat at the top of the page, Naomi Caldwell, undergraduate researcher, applied physics. Jamal felt a jolt of recognition, not the name itself, but the cadence of the language, the precision, the restraint. Naomi had described a pattern of behavior, not an incident. She wrote about being praised in private and undermined in public, about having her data questioned selectively, about being advised to temper ambition, while her peers were encouraged to pursue grants and external validation. She named Professor Gregory Laskin directly, documenting dates, meetings, and contradictions with a clarity that left little room for doubt. Gossman scrolled. Attached emails followed, their timestamps telling a familiar story. Naomi had reached out to administrators after Laskin blocked her from presenting at an external symposium, citing insufficient maturity. She had asked why her propulsion submodel, flagged as innovative in internal reviews, was suddenly being labeled unstable when evaluated for outside audiences. The replies were courteous, non-committal, heavy with phrases like "we'll look into it," and "these matters require discretion." Jamal recognized the tone immediately. It was the same language that had been used to quiet him, to slow him down until momentum died. The next document made his throat tighten. An internship rejection letter from NASA, polite and brief, citing concerns raised by academic partners. No specifics, no appeal process. Naomi had forwarded it to Harvard administrators, with a single line: "This feels retaliatory." The response came 2 weeks later. The university thanked her for her feedback and reminded her of the importance of maintaining professional relationships. Shortly after that, the record went silent. Gossman stopped scrolling. "That's where it ends officially," he said quietly. Jamal leaned closer, eyes scanning the margins, the metadata, the faint digital fingerprints left behind. "What happened to her?" Gossman shook his head. "She withdrew the following semester. Officially for personal reasons. Unofficially?" He paused. "She tried to go public." Jamal looked up sharply. "There's a note here," Gossman continued, reopening the folder and navigating to a subfile marked Correspondence. External. She contacted a science journalist, shared parts of this file. Before anything ran, the story was killed. The journalist changed beats a month later. Naomi applied to 3 other programs, rejected from all of them. Jamal felt the familiar chill of recognition. And then she disappeared, Gossman said. No academic record after that. No publications, no LinkedIn. It's like she stepped off the map. They stood in silence, the weight of it pressing down. Jamal imagined Naomi at his age, brilliant, hopeful, careful, doing everything right, and still being crushed by the same invisible machinery. This wasn't coincidence. It was inheritance. The same professor, the same methods, the same outcome. The system didn't just protect itself, it refined itself, learning how to erase people more efficiently each time. "There's more," Gossman said, voice lower now. He pulled up an audio file, grainy and incomplete, labeled "Meeting Notes Confidential." Naomi's voice filled the room, steady but strained, explaining her concerns to a review panel. She spoke about patterns, about fear, about how isolation was being used as leverage. At one point she said something that made Jamal's chest tighten. She said she wasn't asking for fucker, only for acknowledgement. The recording cut off abruptly, mid-sentence. Jamal closed his eyes briefly. He could almost hear his own voice layered over hers, separated by a decade, but bound by the same disbelief. When he opened them again, he saw his reflection in the darkened screen, older than he had been weeks ago, sharpened by clarity he hadn't wanted, but could no longer ignore. "They learned from her," Jamal said quietly. "They got better at it." Gossman nodded. "And they're betting you won't connect the dots in time." Back in his temporary housing that night, Jamal couldn't sleep. Naomi's name echoed in his head, not as a ghost, but as a warning. He searched quietly, carefully, avoiding institutional networks, tracing fragments across the open web. Old conference attendee lists, archived forum posts, a single comment under a decade-old article about women of color in STEM, signed only with initials. Each lead faded just as it sharpened, as if someone had gone through afterward and sanded the edges down. Near dawn, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, unhurried and precise, the kind that belonged to someone used to asking questions and not always liking the answers. The caller introduced himself as Daniel Moore, a private investigator specializing in academic misconduct cases. He said he'd been following Jamal's situation quietly, that certain names tended to surface together when institutions circled the wagons. He didn't mention Naomi Caldwell at first. He waited. Jamal said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "She's alive," Moore said finally. The words landed with unexpected force. Jamal sat up, heart pounding. "I believe so," Moore continued. "Off the grid by design. Different name, different state. She didn't vanish. She was pushed." Jamal's voice came out low and steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she tried to warn people," Moore replied. "And because now you're standing where she stood. I've been looking for someone who'd listen before it was too late." Jamal asked what he wanted. Moore didn't hesitate. He said finding Naomi would require resources, discretion, and risk. He said institutions didn't like their buried stories resurfacing, especially when patterns became undeniable. He said Jamal needed to understand that reopening this chapter wouldn't just threaten careers, it would threaten narratives powerful people depended on. Then he named his price. Not money. Cooperation. I need access to what you have, Moore said. Everything. Files, names, timelines. If I do this, I do it right. And that means exposure. Jamal looked out the window as the first light of morning crept in, painting the city in pale gold. He thought about Naomi, about Malik, about the cleaning woman, about the list that had tried to erase him before he could begin. He thought about how close he had come to staying silent, and how silence had never protected anyone but the system itself. Send me your terms, Jamal said finally. The call ended without ceremony. Jamal sat there for a long moment, the path ahead narrowing and sharpening all at once. He knew now that this wasn't just about reclaiming his work or clearing his name. It was about pulling a thread that had been deliberately hidden, trusting that the fabric it unraveled was worth the cost. As Jamal's phone lit up with a secure message containing a location and a deadline, he realized that finding Naomi Caldwell might be the key to exposing everything, or the final mistake that ensured he'd never be allowed back inside the world he was trying to change. The address Daniel Moore sent wasn't a location in the traditional sense. It was a link masked behind layers of encryption, routed through multiple servers, reachable only through a specialized browser, and temporary credentials that expired every few hours. Jamal recognized the architecture immediately. This wasn't just a secure site, it was a vault, built for people who had run out of safe spaces. The landing page was minimalist, devoid of logos or banners. A simple welcome line blinked at the top. For those they tried to silence. Below that, a login portal. Jamal entered the provided credentials. The page flickered, then unfolded like a door quietly creaking open. What he saw inside stunned him. Thread after thread, hundreds of them, each authored by individuals who identified themselves only by pseudonyms, sometimes initials, sometimes oblique references to old institutions. Every thread told a story, stories that echoed, overlapped, and sometimes mirrored his own, so precisely it felt like looking into parallel timelines. One user, Black Signal 42, wrote about being cut off from lab access, 2 days after receiving a grant from an independent funder. Another, STEM No More, described a mentor turning hostile once their work gained external attention. Then there was Fahrenheit Gray, who had tracked down the exact moment their research paper had been stripped of authorship before publication. Some entries were brief, others were long, almost journalistic in their structure, complete with internal memos, screenshots of conversations, performance reviews with language that tiptoed around race, while punishing its presence. Many of them listed Ivy League schools. A pattern emerged quickly. The more disruptive the work, the more it challenged existing paradigms, particularly in physics, AI, or defense, the more likely it was to trigger what the users referred to as the drift. That's what they called it when someone started disappearing from access, from committees, from the attention they had earned. Not because of performance but because they had become too visible. Jamal read for hours, barely blinking. He found posts dated years apart, but identical in tone. Rejection letters, sudden drops in funding, whispers of cultural misfit. Most of the users had stopped trying to re-enter academia. Some had moved overseas, some were living under aliases, building in private. One user claimed they had found physical listening devices in their office after a breakthrough. Another said they had once seen their own work being pitched at a government conference, under a white researcher's name. There was no moderation, in the usual sense. No usernames in bold, no hierarchy. But the trust was palpable. This was a gathering of ghosts, erased voices writing themselves back into the record. Then Jamal noticed a thread marked with a red lock icon. It wasn't clickable, but underneath it was a new post, only minutes old. The user went by the name C1990, and their avatar was just a black circle. The message was brief. Harvard propulsion boy made it. They're moving faster now. Pattern is active. Watch your step. The replies came fast. Users welcoming Jamal indirectly, referencing his viral video, calling him the one they couldn't bury cleanly. Others were more cautious, warning him to watch for planted disinformation, to mirror everything, to expect his devices to be compromised. Jamal hesitated, then typed a reply. They flagged me, they blacklisted me, and they tried to erase Naomi Caldwell. A moment later, A direct message request appeared. User, orbits broke. She was one of us. Don't trust more blindly. He trades information for survival. Another message followed from a different user. Check the 209 symposium archives. Follow the funding trail. Her work didn't vanish. It was rebranded. Jamal's hands moved fast now, searching the directory's resource tabs. He found a hidden subsection labeled Retractions. Inside were dozens of files cataloging cases where black researchers' work had been scrubbed, only to re-emerge months or years later, under sanitized titles and new authorship. Then he saw it. Project Tempestus, 2010 JPL PLA Lockridge Dynamics. The attached concept diagrams looked painfully familiar, not identical to Naomi's propulsion model, but built on the same architecture, the same acceleration algorithm, the same framing language she had used in her original complaint documents. The author listed on the rebranded file, Principal Investigator G. Laskin. Jamal's stomach turned. He scrolled down, heart pounding. A second image was attached at the bottom, a grainy still from what appeared to be a closed-door defense tech symposium. Two men were centered in the frame, shaking hands near a classified exhibit. Jamal's eyes froze. The man on the left was Professor Gregory Laskin, and the man on the right, smiling tightly, a folder in his hand, was Brent Kershaw, Senior Development Executive at Lockridge Dynamics. Jamal recognized him instantly. It was the same man who had tried to sit in his seat on the flight to California. He sat back, air shallow in his lungs. The circle was now unmistakably complete. Laskin hadn't just sabotaged students to preserve prestige, he had been laundering innovation from black minds and feeding it to defense contractors in exchange for silent partnerships and power. Harvard wasn't just complicit, it was a pipeline, and Naomi had been the first to threaten its secrecy. The thread lit up with reactions, users posting confirmation, more stills, mentions of others who'd tried to connect the dots but got buried before the story could surface. A new message appeared from Orbits Broke. They'll come for you now, but you're not alone anymore. Jamal stared at the screen, the weight of legacy and theft and silent war sitting on his shoulders. But underneath it, for the first time, something else stirred. Not fear, not rage, but unity. Proof that they hadn't all vanished. Proof that resistance was alive, coded in the margins, waiting for someone bold enough to bring it back to the surface. As Jamal went to close the browser, a private chat popped up from a new user, Redshift Echo. Just 3 words appeared. I have Naomi. The message from Redshift Echo pulsed on Jamal's screen, glowing like a flare in the dark. I have Naomi. He didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. The weight of that statement hit like a wave, sweeping over everything he'd been holding together. Naomi Caldwell, the woman who had tried to sound the alarm before the world was ready to listen, wasn't just alive, she was watching, connected, maybe even guiding from the shadows. The underground network hadn't just remembered her, they'd been protecting her. Jamal typed quickly, his fingers flying across the keyboard, asking if she was safe, if she was willing to talk, if she would help him finish what she'd started. The reply was brief, measured. She's not ready to be seen, but she's watching, and she believes in you. Then another line followed. Time to go ghost. Those 4 words ignited something in Jamal. The walls of elite institutions had closed in on him. Yes. But in the shadows among the silenced and erased, he had found something more powerful than validation. He had found strategy. The underground network wasn't just a support system, it was an engine. A silent collective of stolen voices building in secret, waiting for someone to make the next move. Jamal shut down his personal laptop and moved to an offline machine, one built for isolation and privacy. Through onion-layered servers and untraceable VPNs, he accessed the internal comp space of the Orion Initiative, a global competition run by an international tech and science consortium. The competition sought radical propulsion concepts, with applicants ranging from government-funded teams to billionaire-backed labs. It was the kind of contest Harvard would never let him near, which made it perfect. He uploaded a refined version of his propulsion model, updated with enhanced algorithms, anonymous metadata, and no traces of the work tied to his academic identity. With the help of Fahrenheit Gray and Black Signal 42, he cleaned every fingerprint, ran the submission through layers of misdirection, and assigned it a pseudonym that meant something only to him, N. Crescent, a quiet tribute to Naomi Caldwell. The model was submitted under a cover story, an international collective of anonymous researchers, no institutional affiliations, no university banners, just data, code, proof. Then came the silence. For 4 days, Jamal barely slept. He stayed in the underground network's chat threads, watching in real time as users across time zones pinged in with encouragement, updates, and protection. Some had insider knowledge from past contests. Others used backdoors to monitor the submission queue. All of them had been pushed out once, and now they pushed back with a ferocity institutions had never expected. On the 5th day, the shortlist was posted, and Crescent was at the top. Jamal sat frozen in front of the screen, jaw clenched, unable to breathe for a full 10 seconds. He checked again, then again. It was real. Out of thousands of submissions from across the globe, his model, scrubbed clean of Harvard, stripped of his name, judged on nothing but merit, had emerged as the #1 innovation. 2 days later, a video was released. A panel of judges praising the clarity of the propulsion logic, the unprecedented efficiency of the AI calibration, the elegance of the orbital response algorithm. They called it the most promising advancement in off-world propulsion seen in the last decade. The clip went viral, and that's when the twist came. Harvard released a statement, a proud tweet, a press release, a staged photo of the dean in front of a student mural, captioned with hollow pride, "We're thrilled to see one of our brightest young minds leading innovation on the world stage. Congratulations to Jamal Trenton, Harvard's own." Jamal stared at the screen in disbelief. The same university that had flagged him, suspended him, isolated him. The same place that had called him unstable, combative, academically concerning was now trying to claim him, publicly, loudly, falsely. They hadn't just turned the knife, they were polishing it for the camera. The media followed quickly. Articles labeled him a Harvard rocket genius. Social accounts reposted the image of him from the viral classroom clip, pairing it with headlines like "From Humiliation to History" and "The Black Prodigy Harvard Nearly Lost." The irony burned hot in Jamal's veins. They had never lost him. They had tried to erase him. He didn't respond. He didn't grant interviews. The underground network advised patience, strategy. Let the world congratulate a lie just long enough for it to become brittle. 3 days later, the Orion Initiative hosted a live-streamed award ceremony. Finalists were invited to present digitally, their voices disguised, their faces hidden by mutual agreement. It was about the work, not the performance. Jamal watched from his safe room, his slide deck displayed, his voice modulated, his propulsion model presented clearly, line by line. It was the culmination of everything he'd endured, and as the judges announced Crescent as the official winner, the chat on the live stream exploded. Scientists, engineers, viewers, all calling it revolutionary. Then the final twist arrived, delivered with surgical timing. Just as the feed cut to the host wrapping the ceremony, an unlisted clip was inserted into the stream. It was a video, 60 seconds, clean, direct. It began with a black screen and white text. "The model you just celebrated belongs to a student Harvard tried to erase." Then came footage, never before seen clips from internal committee meetings, classroom recordings, and emails from the network's archive. Jamal's probation letter, Laskin's surveillance footage, the blacklist metadata, the internal NASA correspondence, all lined up in sequence. One damning revelation after another. The stream was pulled offline within minutes, but not before it was downloaded thousands of times. Within hours, the hashtag "Jun credited, not claimed" began trending. Jamal's name flooded back into the global spotlight. But this time, not as a footnote under Harvard's glory. This time, as a case study in institutional betrayal and resist. As the backlash builds and Harvard scrambles to rewrite its narrative, Jamal receives a secure message from NASA Legal Affairs. "We need to talk. Your project has now triggered a classified review." The inbox notification sat like a grenade in Jamal's email. Subject: Urgent, Project Tempestus, under national review. NASA Legal Affairs wasn't reaching out with congratulations. They weren't praising his propulsion victory or the precision of his AI simulations. They were warning him. The global livestream had not just made noise. It had cracked something deep inside the walls of institutions that fed off secrecy. He had moved from the margins of academia to the eye of a political storm. And for the first time, they couldn't bury the truth fast enough. The message from NASA was formal, yet fraught with tension. His propulsion work, initially considered cutting edge, had now triggered red flags among government contractors who believed it overlapped with proprietary military research, particularly that licensed through Lockridge Dynamics. Jamal read the lines again. There are concerns that classified propulsion architectures have been compromised or reverse engineered. "We are conducting an internal audit. You are advised not to speak publicly until this inquiry is concluded." But it was too late for silence. The livestream takedown had already sparked a digital uprising. The clip exposing Harvard's hypocrisy and the long-buried files of institutional sabotage had been reshared across social media thousands of times. Black academics, some tenured, some long disappeared from public life, began reposting their own experiences, each echoing the same themes: erasure, humiliation, and retaliation, disguised as standards. And then, Jamal spoke. He recorded a video not polished, not cinematic, just him in a plain room, eyes steady, voice low. In it he laid out the entire truth, not just about Laskin, not just about Harvard, but about how institutions weaponized language, bureaucracy and professional conduct to silence Black excellence that didn't conform. He walked viewers through the digital paper trail, the surveillance footage, the internal emails, the blacklist, the rebranded text submitted under Laskin's name. He ended the video not with anger, but clarity. You can silence people with policies. You can steal from them in boardrooms. But eventually the truth learns how to speak, and this time, it's not whispering. The video exploded online. Within 12 hours, it was headline news. Cable networks invited Jamal for interviews. Ivy League PR teams scrambled to issue statements. Lockridge Dynamics denied wrongdoing but refused to answer direct questions. NASA issued a cautious note saying they were reviewing the integrity of submission records and institutional collaborations, but it wasn't enough to slow the storm. The moment that truly detonated everything, though, came live on national television. It was supposed to be a standard university spotlight segment, featuring Professor Gregory Laskin on a morning show to discuss nurturing innovation in young scientists. The hosts began with flattery, showcasing his past accolades, but what Laskin didn't know was that one of the journalists, Deja Torres, an award-winning investigative reporter, had gone rogue with the segment. She cut to Jamal's viral video mid-interview, playing a 15-second clip of Laskin meeting with the Lockridge executive. The studio went quiet. Laskin's smile froze. Deja leaned forward and asked, "Professor, can you explain why you're listed as a lead consultant on a defense contract that mirrors your former student's propulsion model, just months after flagging him for academic misconduct?" For the first time, the polished veneer cracked. Laskin shifted in his seat, eyes darting, jaw tightening. "This is not the appropriate forum for that kind of question," he said. But Deja pressed on. "Then what is the appropriate forum to explain how multiple Black students spanning over a decade filed complaints about your behavior and mysteriously left the program without support?" The meltdown unfolded in real time. Laskin's voice rose, his usual academic restraint vanishing. "This kind of witch hunt is why people like him never last. They don't respect hierarchy. They don't respect how this system works." Gasps echoed through the studio. Even the other anchor froze, unsure how to recover. Laskin continued, unaware of the disaster unraveling. "We gave him an opportunity. He abused it. He made himself a victim because he couldn't handle pressure." Deja's face remained calm, but her voice sliced like a blade. "So what exactly was your role in the probation letter? And how do you explain that the propulsion project you rejected is now being evaluated for classified review by NASA?" Laskin stood up, ripping off his mic. "You people think you're journalists, but you're just agitators. You'll destroy academia with this kind of identity politics." The live feed cut awkwardly, but the damage was done. Clips of the meltdown were online within minutes. Hashtags trended. Laskin exposed. Sabotage in STEM. Jamal was right. For the first time, the broader public didn't just see a student fighting a system. They saw the system exposing itself, live and unfiltered. Harvard released a statement within an hour, announcing that Professor Laskin had been placed on temporary leave pending further investigation. But the wording reeked of damage control. It didn't stop Jamal's inbox from flooding with messages from other students, faculty members, and whistleblowers, all sharing their own stories. Many hadn't spoken in years. Some were tenured professors. Others had long since left academia. One message read, "You just kicked open the door we've all been knocking on." But the biggest surprise came not from the public but from Capitol Hill. Jamal received an encrypted message from the office of Congresswoman Adrienne Chalmers, chair of the Subcommittee on Education Oversight. She had watched the video. Her staff had seen the live stream. She wanted Jamal to testify publicly before Congress, not just about Harvard, but about systemic academic suppression, tech pipeline corruption, and the racialized sabotage embedded in elite institutions. The message ended with a clear statement. "What happened to you is not isolated. It is engineered. We want the country to hear the whole story on record. Jamal didn't respond immediately. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. Going to Congress would mean putting everything on the table, every file, every name, every institutional betrayal. It would mean being a national face for a conversation few in power wanted to have. But before he could decide, the next shock landed. That night, as the world debated Harvard's guilt in Lockridge's silence, a breaking news alert interrupted the late-night cycle. Professor Gregory Laskin, reported missing. Last seen exiting a private car in Boston's financial district. Car found. Laskin not inside. Jamal froze, staring at the television. The reporter continued. Authorities have not confirmed foul play, but sources say he was under investigation for misconduct related to defense contracts and academic suppression. More details to follow. The screen cut to an aerial shot. Police tape surrounding a black sedan. Doors open. Keys still in the ignition. Jamal's pulse thundered in his ears. The system had started to fracture. But now someone, maybe more than one, was trying to clean it up before it fully collapsed. As Jamal backed away from the screen, his phone lit up with a new message from an unknown number. You're not safe either. Don't show up in DC. The morning after the national scandal broke, Jamal awoke to the glow of his phone screen. Multiple notifications, messages, headlines. The world was finally talking about what he'd endured, but the conversation had already shifted. In the hours since his public testimony had been confirmed, journalists and investigators began digging deeper into why the campaign against him had been so coordinated. It was no longer about one professor or one university. It was about an entire ecosystem that protected power and punished anyone who threatened its profit margin. Late the night before, an unmarked envelope had been slipped under his door. Inside was a single page printed with a donor ledger from Harvard's Office of Development, something a graduate student shouldn't have access to. But someone wanted him to see it. At the bottom of the ledger, a name stood out. Augustus Gus Whitford, followed by sums of seven-figure contributions earmarked for research initiatives, military partnerships, and something simply labeled strategic defense projects. Jamal had never heard of him, but the ledger made it clear Whitford wasn't just any benefactor. He had his fingers deep in every contract that bridged Harvard's research arms with defense contractors and federal agencies. Jamal sat at his desk, coffee long gone cold, staring at the name while images from the previous day's meltdown played across his mind like a fractured film reel. The public had seen Laskin collapse under pressure on live TV. What they hadn't seen were the documents that tied his professor's actions to a broader agenda. And now this ledger hinted at a puppeteer far larger than a single toxic academic. He texted Ariana Keller, hoping she'd help authenticate the ledger and its implications. She responded within minutes. Meet me. This is bigger than you think. The urgency in her words matched the tremor Jamal felt in his own voice when he spoke aloud. This looks like influence laundering. By noon, they were both in a secure meeting room, the ledger spread between them like evidence in a trial. Ariana's trained eye went over each entry, her brow furrowing deeper with every line.
Look at this,
She said, finger tracing a string of donations to something called the Harvard Defense Integration Initiative. It was followed by a direct transfer to Lockridge Dynamics, without university board approval. That meant someone had the actual authority to bypass governance structures and push funds directly toward contracts that benefited both academia and private defense firms. Jamal felt his pulse quicken. The pattern he'd uncovered with Naomi Caldwell, the archived whistleblower reports, the internal blacklists, even the leaked Project Tempestus model. The money trail winded back here, to Whitford's name repeated like a signature across every suspicious node. Ariana looked up slowly. He's not just a donor, he's a gatekeeper between the academy and the war machine. And that money buys results, in research direction, in contract allocations, in who gets elevated, and who gets buried. Jamal absorbed that, the weight of it settling like stone in his gut. It wasn't just Laskin protecting his turf. It was part of a broader system that funneled talent, innovation, intellectual property, into structures designed less for scientific progress than for defense superiority and profit. They decided to verify the ledger through external channels, cross-referencing with public IRS filings, defense contract disclosures, and locked-down grants databases. What they uncovered next stunned them both. Whitford wasn't just a benefactor. He sat on strategic advisory boards for several of the largest defense contracts in the country. His fingerprints were all over multi-billion-dollar agreements between private firms and federal agencies, including ones involving Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and niche tech integrators, who had quietly absorbed proprietary research from universities nationwide. QuincyInts.org. Jamal and Ariana realized the smear campaign against him wasn't isolated. It was a protective shell around a pipeline of influence that benefited from controlling the narrative on who gets to contribute to high-value military contracts. If a black student's innovation threatened to reroute that pipeline or worse, expose how the pipeline worked, then the system moved to neutralize the threat. The unexpected part came when they pulled the Harvard Defense Integration Initiative's registration documents. There, under a section labeled Conflict of Interest Oversight, was something Jamal never expected to see: a clause that exempted major donors from standard disclosure requirements, specifically for projects involving classified or dual-use technology. In plain language, Whitford and those like him were legally empowered within the university to influence procurement channels without transparency. It was an institutional loophole designed, astonishingly, to let private power shape public research outcomes without accountability. As the truth anchored itself in Jamal's mind, Ariana said, "This is why they targeted you. Your work didn't just threaten academic norms, it threatened billions in projected military and defense spending." Jamal felt that logic chisel away at everything he had endured. Suddenly, the blacklists, the internal pressure, the sabotage, the isolation, they were no longer isolated acts of one professor's bias. They were strategy, calculated and funded. Emails and texts began flooding Jamal's phone. Journalists, advocates, academic allies, and even former students, offering witness statements. One email came from Naomi Caldwell herself, the woman once erased from history. Her message was concise but seismic. "I warned them once. I won't let it happen again." Attached were her own archived files, emails between her and Whitford's office, suggesting that during her time he had pressured university administrators to suppress her breakthroughs, under the guise of national security concerns. It was unthinkable. Naomi's disappearance was no accident. She had been marginalized, sidelined, and effectively warned to retreat, just as Jamal had been. The pattern wasn't just academic sabotage, it was centralized suppression, backed by money and power more entrenched than anyone had expected. Jamal felt the room tilt, but Ariana's voice brought him back. "We need to expose this," she said, her tone fierce but measured. "This is the real story. But if we do..." Jamal hesitated. "If we go after Whitford, we're not just exposing academic corruption. We're exposing the military-industrial complex's grip on innovation pipelines. That's bigger than Harvard. That's every institution that benefits from that funnel." Ariana nodded, which is exactly why this has been buried. Not because it's isolated to one chem lab or one tenure decision, but because it threatens the economic architecture of defense research in this country. Jamal's breath caught as the enormity of their situation sank in. He had thought exposure meant clearing his name and forcing Harvard to account for one professor's racism. Instead, it meant unmasking a network where racism was a tool, not a bug. A mechanism to protect profits, not principles. They compiled their findings, documents, ledgers, email threads, contractual links, and archived testimony into a comprehensive dossier. They shared it with a coalition of investigative journalists who were already tracking the defense academic nexus. Within hours, a headline appeared that would rock not just Harvard but the entire ecosystem of defense research funding. Exclusive. Shadow donor linked to multi-billion-dollar military contracts orchestrated campaign to suppress black innovation.
The article was a masterpiece of evidence-based reporting. It laid out how private money had shaped academic research paths, how non-disclosure loopholes had been used to bypass oversight, and how the smear campaign against Jamal fit neatly into a pattern of institutional protectionism for high-value defense technologies. The piece rippled through media outlets, triggering outrage from advocacy groups, lawmakers, and academic watchdogs.
Within 24 hours, congressional aides were drafting subpoenas. Internal investigations were announced. Whitford, who had previously operated behind a veil of prestige and anonymity, suddenly found his name splashed across national headlines. Institutions that once defended him now distanced themselves. Then Jamal's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unlisted number. He didn't recognize the voice at first. Low, steady, unfamiliar. "Jamal Trenton?" the voice asked. He hesitated, then said, "Yes." A pause. "We've been watching. Your work has real potential. Not just in labs, but for missions no one has been willing to fund openly." Jamal frowned. "Who is this?" There was a deliberate exhale on the other end. "Let's just say someone who doesn't operate in the shadows," the voice said. Someone who believes in your work and wants to see it reach its full potential. Then, 4 simple words. You ready for Mars? Jamal's mind raced as the line went silent, the meaning of those words dissolving and reforming into something he had only dreamed of. Only now, the cost of answering wasn't just his career, but the truth itself. Jamal's phone rang before dawn, an unusual hour for good news, especially after weeks of chaos. When he answered, the voice on the other end was calm, measured, and strangely sincere. Internship acceptance letter from NASA's Mars Propulsion Lab. The words echoed in his mind long after he hung up, a surreal mix of disbelief and vindication that felt almost too perfect to be real. But the email itself, official, time-stamped with an encrypted access link, proved it was no dream. He was officially invited to join NASA's Mars Propulsion Lab as an intern, the youngest black engineer ever selected for such a position. The irony was thicker than the Mars atmosphere he was about to help navigate. The very institution that had once been part of his silencing was now granting him a seat at the table he'd been banned from. He didn't celebrate. Not yet. Instead, he sat at his desk, lit only by the glow of his laptop, replaying every moment that had led him here. The laughter in Sanders Theater, the probation letter that felt like a noose, the hidden files, the underground network, the viral live stream takedown, the leaked dossier, exposing Harvard's systemic suppression, and the congressional attention that had made every institution implicated quake. The victory was monumental, but it wasn't clean. It was jagged, emotional, unpolished, like fire-forging steel. That morning, Harvard issued a public apology. It was carefully worded, full of institutional jargon and corporate compassion. The statement acknowledged past errors in judgment and a failure to support a promising student fully, expressing regret for the hurt and harm caused. Press releases spread across news feeds, retweeted by alumni and academic commentators eager to reframe the narrative. But Jamal didn't respond. Not with a comment, not with a tweet, not with a press conference. His silence was not absence. It was sovereignty. He had no appetite for Harvard's repentance tour. His focus had shifted far beyond their walls. Ariana Keller met him outside NASA's gate on the first day of his internship. The sunrise was pale, promising a heat that hadn't yet arrived. She handed him a secure clearance badge, the kind that felt heavier in your hand because it wasn't a symbolic piece of plastic, but a key to entire worlds. You ready? She asked, voice steady, with something between pride and exhaustion. Jamal didn't answer immediately. He breathed deeply and let the moment settle. Yes, he thought. I'm ready. They walked through the doors together, past security lines and personnel scanners that beeped without judgment. It was procedural neutrality, not permission. Jamal had earned this in ways no one at Harvard ever had to. Inside the Mars Propulsion Lab, the air smelled of clean metal and expectation. Engineers clustered around workstations humming with simulations, hydrazine models and gravity equations that seemed almost living. Jamal's station waited at the far end of a long corridor, its glass panel etched with his name and title. Jamal Trenton, intern research engineer. He hesitated before stepping inside, as if taking a breath before a plunge into a life he'd once thought impossible. His first assignment was straightforward: review a propulsion variance simulation that had recently stalled progress. The previous engineer had tried and failed to solve a feedback loop error in the Martian atmospheric model. Everyone else had abandoned it after weeks of stalled results. Jamal didn't see abandon as a permanent condition. He saw it as an invitation. Hours passed without anyone noticing him except for occasional glances from seasoned scientists, curious about the new prodigy. But when the variance simulation began to converge under Jamal's adjustments, incrementally, but unmistakably, the room that had been silent suddenly pulled in closer. Conversations resumed, not about social media clips or viral fame, but about physics, optimization, and solutions that once seemed out of reach. He didn't announce progress. He simply solved it. A senior engineer leaned over his screen and nodded without speaking. That was NASA's way of acknowledging brilliance. Quiet respect, unadorned by spectacle. By mid-afternoon, his email pinged with a message from NASA leadership. It wasn't just praise. It was an invitation to co-lead a subcommittee on adaptive propulsion strategies for the upcoming Mars Meku 4 project. The proposal demanded intelligence, creativity, and the ability to challenge assumptions, precisely the skills the institutions that once targeted him had tried to erase. Word spread fast. Jamal's name, once flagged as a disciplinary risk, was now marked as high-value human capital. His trajectory was no longer about repairing a tarnished reputation. It was about rewriting the future of deep space travel. Yet despite NASA's embrace, memories of past betrayals lingered in Jamal's mind, not as wounds, but as instruments of precision he could never unlearn. In meetings with engineers and scientists, he found himself sometimes reflecting aloud on corner cases, historical inconsistencies, and patterns that had once seemed abstract but now felt intimately familiar. He spoke about frameworks and feedback loops like he spoke about survival, with nuance, patience, and unvarnished truth. It was during one of these meetings, mid-presentation, mid-equation, that an unexpected voice cut through the technical discourse. "You've got an email." Jamal turned. A NASA admin stood behind him, her expression neutral but insistent. From Public Affairs. He opened it. The headline was simple: Harvard's apology. Too little too late. The body contained transcripts of faculty interviews, alumni defenses, and alumni protests framing Jamal's exposure as agenda politics, overblown narratives, and mischaracterizations of institutional intent. The apology was dissected, parsed, and repackaged as a PR stunt. Jamal exhaled. The apology he'd ignored wasn't being ignored by the world. A voice beside him, soft, reflective, spoke in a low tone. "Welcome to relevance." It was Ariana, but there was more in her eyes than familiarity. There was caution. What had once been momentum was now metastasizing into scrutiny. Being at NASA didn't neutralize the forces he'd exposed. It magnified them. The next week, Jamal was asked to join a televised panel discussion on innovation and institutional accountability. Experts from academia, policy, and space research convened. Harvard's dean participated via video link, offering conciliatory remarks wrapped in careful language. Lockridge Dynamics sent a representative, their statements polished and detached. A defense contractor lobbyist argued that safeguarding classified research was paramount, no matter the collateral human cost. Jamal sat in silence until it was his turn to speak. He didn't recite talking points. He didn't deliver sound bites. He spoke from memory. The cold halls, the clips, the probation letter, the underground network, Naomi's files, the leaked ledger, the congressional interest, and every moment that nearly broke him. And throughout his testimony, he remained precise, controlled, deeply human. The broadcast cut to a commercial break with his final line echoing in viewers' ears. Innovation isn't just about technology, it's about who gets to build it, and why we've spent so long telling the world that some of us aren't worthy before we ever let them try. The reaction was immediate. Some praising him as a visionary truth-teller, others attacking him as a destabilizing idealist. Twitter feeds ignited. Opinion pieces erupted. The world once again split between admiration and dismissal. Inside NASA, higher-ups monitored the backlash with equal parts awe and apprehension. They respected his intellect, but they were also wary of the political wildfire he had stepped into. External pressure from defense contractors and academic lobbyists began to filter through internal channels, seeking to tame the narrative, redirect credit, reduce disruption, contain Jamal. Yet in the midst of this maelstrom, something unexpected happened. Jamal received a handwritten note in his NASA inbox, rare enough in itself to demand attention. He unsealed it slowly, his name written in ink he recognized instantly, his own handwriting. The note read, simply, "Remember why you started." No signature, no logo, no date. He looked up from the paper, scanning the busy lab around him. Engineers pored over models. Administrative staff moved with purposeful strides. Somewhere nearby, Mars simulation data was rendering in real time. The note felt like a tether anchoring him, not to institution or accolade, but to a beginning, a purpose, a truth he had uncovered only by refusing to let silence be his inheritance. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Then he headed down the long corridor toward Mission Control itself, the place where commands would be sent, histories rewritten, and futures enacted. The room was vast, alive with low hums and bright screens. Technicians monitored telemetry. Scientists interpreted feeds. Hours before, this floor had been a dream. Now it was his reality. As Jamal passed through the final security checkpoint, he noticed a framed quote on the wall near the control consoles. At first he thought it was some generic slogan about courage and exploration, until he realized the handwriting was familiar. He stepped closer. His breath caught. It was written in his own hand. In bold script the quote read, "Science belongs to those brave enough to seek truth, not merely accept it." But beside it, in faint pencil beneath the ink, was a second line he never wrote, a line that chilled him to the core, and truth is owned by those who survive its cost. If you believe silence should never protect injustice, type yes in the comments. Have you ever witnessed brilliance being buried just because of where someone came from or what they looked like? Subscribe for more untold stories that deserve the light. Together, let's keep building a world where truth can't be blacklisted.